Alright, so I don't know how many visuals this video is going to have. This is probably one of the most researched videos I've ever made. And that's not actually saying that much, but it does set a precedence for how much more reading and wiki cross-referencing and deeply analyzing the same few posts from Scott over and over again for meaning that I have done lately while helping my friend move. So, sorry if this isn't the great visual spectacle I would like it to be. It's really hard to make this visually interesting, so this might be borderline a podcast for this episode. December 4th, 2017, Fnaf 6 comes out as the true finale to the series, meant to answer all of the latest questions. Or at least most of them. December 26th, a mere 22 days after Fnaf 6, also in 2017, the survival logbook is set to reveal some more answers, maybe expand upon the few things that Fnaf 6 missed. June 26, 2018, The Fourth Closet comes out, ending off the novel trilogy. June 27th, a day later, 2018, 6 total months roughly after Fnaf 6, UCN comes out, and acts as the sort of epilogue to the franchise with its main villain suffering in something eternally at the hands of a mysterious child, one who claims to be more important than any other. May 28th, 2019, Fnaf Help Wanted comes out. We're not going to be talking about it too much, just know it was out at this point. December 26th, 2019, Into the Pit, the beginning of the Fazbear Frights journey begins. January 2020, Scott makes a Reddit post talking about headcanons and fandoms and interpretations of things. Some later stories will answer some of the biggest questions from this past year, in my opinion, which Scott would later clarify as being specifically for the Fazbear Frights books. July 7th, 2020. September 1st, 2020, we get Man in Room 1280 from Book 5, which is Andrew's kind of origin story. December 29th, we get Jake's origin story in The Real Jake in Book 6, Blackbird. We're going to skip over the next Frights books because it is just Frights books constantly until Security Breach. And right after Security Breach, 1 month later, Tales from the Pizzaplex begins. Security Breach and Tales won't be super important for this video, but just know that that is the time period we're working with. So my goal for this video is to sort of make this list and what I'm going to get at more digestible. More pressingly, however, I want to talk about Fazbear Frights, which I will be talking about, I feel like, in a lot of videos, considering that it is probably the most complicated topic to tackle right now. So I want to look at one specific corner of it. Could Stitchline even be the original intent or not? Or is this an example of a ScottCon? ScottCon, when information really wasn't intended to be used a certain way, but is basically repurposed to fit a new, expanded upon meaning without fully retconning the original intent. I.e. stuff like the Fnaf 2 yellow suit later being revealed to be Springtrap, even though there's no way we could have known that, nor was it probably planned at all by Scott. I would say one of the most frequently cited things to prove that Frights was always the intent, or at least was always something that could have been the intent, was this one Reddit post from someone who got a review copy of Lala's game showing that it had metadata from the creation of 2019. In November specifically, I think. The argument basically goes that if Tales was planned a full 3 years before it would come out in 2022, then if we assume Frights was also planned that early, that means it would be planned around late 2017 or early 2018. Therefore, Frights could be considered, when making Pizzeria Simulator, the logbook, and UCN, being proof that these storylines were always the original intent. However, this ignores the apocalyptic-sized elephant in the room, which is the game it was tied to. Now, one of the tricky things about this is, it just says created on, which we don't really know what the context of this review copy was made in, so who knows what the hell this was from. All we know is that the Tales project at least existed in some capacity in 2019 from this, or at least the first books project did. What makes this tricky is the only thing this proves is that Tales' production started a little bit after Help Wanted, because Security Breach was supposed to come out in 2020. All this really shows is that Tales books were probably prolonged and delayed drastically to match the release date with Security Breach, as to not spoil things, I guess. This gives the timeline actually more like a year at most or less. It's kind of hard to tell. Point is, it just means the books were delayed. It really doesn't prove that Scott needs 3 years to plan a short story series. To back up my claims, let's look at Scott's initial post about Fazbear Frights. The earliest mention of Frights was that there was a new book series coming out, and this was announced in November 2018. This is about 1 year prior to Frights actually releasing, which reinforces my theory that it takes about a year for something to be developed after it starts planning or being created, and not 3 years like that Reddit post claims. However, there's even more reason to believe that Frights is extremely incomplete at this point in time because Scott lists it at 20% complete. However, it was also only meant to have 5 books. So this actually means if it's 20% done, there's only 1 book's worth of content done at this point, out of what will go on to be a total of 12 once the series keeps getting extended, meaning that Fazbear Frights is extremely early into development. I'm really just guessing that the first 3 stories were written and some of the plans for the Stitchline stingers were started. And it's worth noting, this post comes 5 months after UCN. And remember, it takes another year on top of this post for the books to actually come out. And there's no arguments that it was delayed the same way Tales was because it doesn't tie into any one specific game. There's no release window for it to line up with. Best case scenario for the original intent arguments, you could maybe argue that UCN is when he started thinking of the idea of Andrew, but there is no argument I can see in which Scott, a full year and a half before he would even start planning a book series, actually had the idea for the whole Andrew story arc to happen. Because there are theories that rely on Andrew already being planned and an important character all the way in Fnaf 6. But that is a topic for another video. Get used to me saying that a lot in this video. So what's interesting about this is that the first extension was that there were going to be 7 books. Considering that it isn't until book 4 and 5 that Andrew and Jake are really introduced and started being exploring, and book 6 that Jake finally gets his origin story. And once again, there was supposed to be 1 more book after Jake's origin story book. I get the sense that Andrew and Jake were more made to be part of this big expansion and step into the Stitchline storyline. Because while it did exist, there is a noticeable shift between the first 3 stingers and the entire rest of the stingers. My guess is that 4 and 5 are kind of what the trash out and amalgam was going to be like. The Stitchline would be this like monster grabbing random parts of these old possessed objects, stuffing them into itself to build itself up, and Larson and all the other cops and people helping him would gang up and beat it with the puppet mask or whatever. But I feel like once Scott knew or had to make more stories or plan stories or get the writers to make more, Andrew and Jake were created to sort of fill in that slot. And there is more reasons for me to believe this. Now, once again, if we go back to that whole 1 year analogy and Security Breach's original release date of late 2020 or early 2021, you can apply a lot of this to how Frights ended up being released. Because where Fazbear Frights was supposed to end, book 5 and then to book 7, is late 2020 to early 2021. Guess where Jake and Andrew show up? Books 5 and 6, the setup for the finale in book 7. The series was even more extended, and what we now know is Cliffs was probably supposed to be the finale book, and then a little bit after Security Breach came out, Tales was supposed to continue the short story trend, but as its own new series focusing on Tales from the Pizzaplex. So to recap, roughly 1 year after Survival Logbook and Fnaf 6, or roughly 4 to 5 months after UCN, somewhere maybe in September, give or take a month, Scott starts planning and tinkering around and signing the deals for Fazbear Frights. 1 year later, after the landing begins, the first book starts releasing. Somewhere around this window, the project becomes way bigger than it was meant to because of Security Breach's delay, because there was supposed to be another book series that he was supposed to transition into, and there needs to be a bigger story arc to fill in that time gap. And over this time period, it would over double in length to fill this entire gargantuan development time for Security Breach, so there still was Fnaf stuff happening. To me, if Frights was genuinely meant to be the original connected 6 and UCN kind of conclusion or solution, it just doesn't have proof it was even in the cards then. I feel like if you're going to argue it is part of that continuity, it's a Scott con. It's something changed to fit and expand upon that, or something like that. if Andrew existed, I don't think it was in FNAF 6, and maybe at earliest it was something he was toying with loosely in the back of his head during the development of UCN. And I do want to restate, this really just is me toying with what I think might have been going on behind the scenes, and this is just me assuming based on quotes and various points of evidence what I think is going on here, or at least happened with Frights. And the real reason I'm making this video is I think it's worth noting why the story is presented in a certain way, and the full perspective of when and how and why these things were made this way. And I feel like people treat things like they all happened at the same time, and then people slosh around information willy-nilly without really considering the context of where these ideas come from. For example, early on, Scott said that Frights' later stories, which at the time meant books 5 to 7, given that that was the original plan, was supposed to answer the questions of the series past. However, that's actually a misquote. He specified that it was questions from the past year, and that context is often cobbled out. The past year was 2019, as this statement was made at the very beginning of 2020. The only things that come out in 2019 are the first book of Fazbear Frights and Help Wanted. And the only story related to Help Wanted, as even just in the VR sense, at least within the first 7 books, is in the flesh.
AKA the fucking Backpack and Craig story.
So either what Scott actually meant was that later books would expand upon the Stitch Wraith, and books 4 to 7 would be the major steps in explaining the prior stories, or Scott actually meant 2018 and just kind of forgot that a year had passed. Questions of the past year just means questions also including 2018's events. It's really hard to interpret that line, given that the only things that happened that year are the launch of Fazbear Frights, Help Wanted, and AR, none of which seem to be really connected in a way where you could argue Frights is the solution to the other two. Or at least not within this point in time where only so many of the books should have been developed. And even if it is talking about all 12 books in terms of the later books, that means one story, Prankster, really acts as a solution for Help Wanted, and the others really don't. One quote says that later books would solve questions recently, and one quote says that it will have connections. It does not mean that the entire Fazbear Frights book series is meant to solve all of the lore of the prior questions. Something I actually forgot to mention on the whole, oh, what's the link between the Ultimate Guide and the Fazbear Frights books trying to imply their canon? But you also get some, weird stuff in the Ultimate Guide that I forgot about, how the Ultimate Guide seems to imply that what we found is the real version of FNAF 3, arguably. And the other weird thing that kind of goes on with this is it specifically calls out the phrase Stinger Moot. The Ultimate Guide connections kind of fall apart the more I thought about them. Because, yeah, it does really seem to be implying that Pizzeria Simulator itself specifically connects to Frights. But at the same time, it's in really weird ways, because other quotes maybe contradict this. I just forgot about that and wanted to add that in here. I really can't emphasize enough that it is not until a year after FNAF 6 that we have the earliest mention of Frights, which seems to be very incomplete at this point in time. And that's still months after UCN, and it's people are trying to argue there's a clear proof it was always on the table. And it just isn't unless there's information we're missing. Given that it takes a while for Andrew to be introduced, given that the book series he's introduced in takes a while to come out after UCN, given that we have an announcement noticeably after UCN, even if it is in the same year, mostly by technicality, honestly, it just is really a stretch to assume Frights was always meant to happen as part of Pizzeria Simulator story, to tie into these story elements that wouldn't exist for over a year. Actually, to be completely honest, it's a couple years, given that it still takes Frights a while to come out on top of its initial announcement. Maybe UCN. I still don't think so, because it seems like the planning happens months after UCN, and the announcement is saying, wow, we just started development on this, it's only 20% of the way done, of an estimate that will be way smaller than what it ended up being. It's probably more accurate to say that Frights was like an 11th of the way done at this point in time. Hell, I almost wonder if Felix the Shark is actually the original draft of Book 1 that had to be scrapped when the Stitch Ray Stingers started being planned and properly written. But that is a completely Hail Mary concept that just crossed my mind while writing this. But once again, this is a topic that's really suited for another bigger video. So for now, even if I'm wrong of 90% things I say here, I'd at least like to deposit these thoughts for consideration and think, where did we get these quotes and ideas from? And look at what Scott was actually saying more. What makes this tricky is Bye.